Okay, welcome back everyone. This is the last session of a very exhilarating and intriguing 3 days, I think, and it's going to be a challenge to recapitulate 3 days in an hour, but we will try, and I'll ask everyone around me to do their part by being brief, conscious, use your self-awareness and your mindfulness to be brief in your answers, because there's a lot of people and we want to hear from everyone. And so we're going to have a couple of questions that essentially come from the Geshes as summarizing a general concern or issue that will be open for any of the panelists, the scientists, to respond to. And then I'm going to ask the presenters to give their own sort of version of what they think happened and what the next step might be. But let me start with the two questions that are sort of summary questions from all the input of the Geshes. What is the most important goal that has been so far achieved in this dialogue between science and Buddhism? And what do you expect to achieve in the future? So, like I said, anyone can take any piece of this, so it's your own perspective, of course. And some people have been part of the dialogue for longer than others, so it's, of course, just what you've seen so far and how you imagine it might play out in the future. So that's open to anyone. Somebody has to be first.
So, the important goal is sharing both ways. Buddhism has over 1,000 years of thinking about the meaning of the words and probing the mind. And science has, the young upstart science has 400 years of probing the physical world. And as we noted in the conference, science has one of its limits in quantum mechanics. As we probe the very small, we run into particles that behave as waves and waves that behave as particles. And when we begin to ask questions of those particles and waves, to do experiments with them, it seems like the question we ask, the consciousness of the observer, the doing of the experiment, interacts with the experiment. And we're on the verge of trying to understand how that can be. And I believe that with this long tradition of Buddhist thought, it might give us some guidance as to how to go about thinking about doing those experiments. And the other important thing from Tibetan medicine, which was, as you try to improve humanity, make it a joyful thing and don't forget to smile. I like that.
Okay, thanks. That's a good start. And a good model for an answer.
Well, I think Paul is one of the people with the most experience with this dialogue, and I'm the one with the least, so I'm probably a good person to follow him. As a Western scientist, I am a methodologist, not a theoretician. So what excites me most about this dialogue is learning new techniques from the Buddhist scholars. The long tradition of technology in meditation and introspection, and just having a vocabulary for all these inner states that we have not begun to explore in the West. And I'm excited about the possibilities of taking some of these techniques and applying them in our Western settings. On a larger scale, though, what I think has been one of the biggest advantages, biggest benefits from this collaboration is a change in attitudes on both sides. I know as a Western scientist, a lot of Westerners feel that science and religion in general are enemies and cannot ever coexist peacefully. And I know from what His Holiness said yesterday that many of his advisors thought that it would be dangerous to introduce science into Buddhist training. And I think what we're seeing here is that there's really a lot more we have in common, and there's a lot more we can do to help each other, and we don't have to be on opposite sides, but we can collaborate in helping enhance our scope of knowledge, enhance our ability to help mankind.
Thank you.
I'm not sure what the very concrete outcome of the interaction here of these programs here in Dharamsala between the scientists and the Tibetan monastics, the community. But I think that there are two. One of them is the changed attitude among the monastics themselves with regard to the science education itself, whether it is an important part of education, that whether it could be an important part of education for the monastics themselves. And I think that over 10, 11 years of the programs that, thanks to the Science for the Monks and the Science Meets Dharma and the recent program, Emerging by Science Initiative, I think it seems like that changed attitude is certainly there. With regard to where we go from here is how the next phase is really implementing it in the monastic curriculum itself. That is the goal of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, is to bring the science into the core curriculum in the monastic education. So that's the kind of the next goal. But I think that the larger kind of dialogue that has been taking place between the scientists and the contemplatives over the last 20, 25 years or so, ever since the first Mind and Life conference in '87 that His Holiness initiated, you can see at one of the really impressive outcome of these dialogues have been, now there is a field called the contemplative science. That this is, it's a real kind of one of the real areas in the academia. And in fact, that in next April, there is going to be a first conference of the contemplative science in Denver, Colorado, which is, which when you look at like in the short period of 25 years or so, it's a tremendous outcome. Now, then what is the next phase for such this from this interaction on that larger scale is, I think that some form of academic program that would teach what His Holiness the Dalai Lama calls secular ethics, which he has emphasized for many years. But I think that's where it needs to go in order to make a real contribution to the larger community by changing the very culture of the people's mindset, because ethics is the key, the ethical kind of engagement is a key for the harmony and the well-being of the society at large.
I'm going to try to expand the question just a tiny bit, in that I want to include not just Buddhism, but the other Indian philosophical and religious traditions. And I think I want to answer the question maybe at three levels. So at the bottommost level, which already is very important, is now the increasing recognition that ideas from these traditions have as much to say about how mind and consciousness and things that are at the forefront of current scientific research are to be investigated. And that if new insights are to come from these traditions, it might overturn the way that this particular mind science is done. But even more, I think, dramatic would be to take things that are at the foundations of science. So the mind sciences are a relatively small corner, right? So physics, in some ways, is the most considered the most fundamental science, and maybe mathematics is seen as fundamental as physics is. And one possibility is that even our ideas of what mathematics and physics are will change because of insights that we get from these traditions. So to give you just a quick example, Geshe Laktor and I, we were talking yesterday that we think of mathematics as just bedrock. 2 + 2 is always 4. But maybe that's just conventional reality, right? And if that was the case, then the entire foundations of science have to be rethought. So these are the kind of radical experiments that can be done in how science itself is to be understood. And partly because when we say science, really it has a specific history in the Western world. And it may not have, if science had developed, the East, in the East, it might have taken a different shape. So these are questions that we can now begin to ask because of this kind of dialogue. But I think the most important effect, I would say, is that the distinction between is and ought, which is so central to modern science, if we can see that that is actually a false distinction, that the way the world ought to be and the way the world is are not that different from each other. And of course, for these contemplative traditions, that's central, because reality is not just the way the world is, but also the way the world ought to be. So that's mine.
Nidong Gunia de Ceres Sabjong Dus Chin Yamshuche Kogabrason and the Inzan de Loshering Debe Nyamyon Lepane Dus Chine Samzu Shuina and the Dus Chin Toling Soya de Pendokari Young Dus Chine Dus Tiva Lev Younger, the Inzan Tanda Gishi, Los Antinzi like Suana Jire Maran Chidan Anzu Mishia Duzum Navi Kablaya Chit Tambo Tambo de 미 파주당 수준이 의료지 차거래 아니 미 파주당 수준이 삼주 딜렌지 고갑지 용거래 안 충전의 시에바 이나가서 다자다자 나라야지 말아서 나로라야지 가브레 직 투모도 비토네 양림부지가 내되거래 다대 사자지가라야 조망부지니야 좀연도 배나 먼저 단다 디나라야 사자간인 에네 페 리즈마제 베다 긴도 망부지도 좀연도 에네 나로라야지 지 소소 제고 남좀 간데 마데 세고 차도거래 에네 대다 리즈um 베드네 다치게 에네 지리 경원 겔라남베기지 롭디나야 데종안줄라야 지 지리 돌아야 고도 배용도 삼바 에네 마라즈기 나즈기 심마데 띵사브서브도야다 페나 페존다 위슈에 나간즈 페나 아니 메도 통고도 세야지 남중간즈 미기 넘버 10에 메도 도고도 신도 딘데시 당간즈 숨겨래 당간 단다 딜 세로 가르도스라나 에네 메도디 또야디 단다 체리 숨다제바이나 근데 왜보 왜게 귤람네 도스니야 미왕 파게 타길 때 안타게진 도스 레바니아 도스데 삼바 니주 페존 디치부 참지다지 만조야 고도디 사브드레지 두기여디 임바인사 긴든바츠에네 체리 장고에디 시라기 개침부 통고 도스네 마라 냠yor단데 덴데지 슈야인 신투시나
I thank you for the opportunity. And so just to say a few words about this question. And I have been participating in this monastic science education program for past 4 years. And based on my experience, I think that there are many things that we can gain from this kind of dialogue. And whenever we have this kind of dialogues, it gives us an opportunity to meet together and share our knowledge. And not to talk about the Buddhist community and the scientific community alone, but this kind of programs give us an opportunity to meet among our Buddhist colleagues, because like normally we belong to different traditions in Tibetan Buddhism, and we tend to live in our own monasteries, and we don't have much opportunity to meet with each other and share our knowledge and wisdom. And this kind of program gave me an opportunity to share my idea with other Tibetan Buddhist colleagues. And another thing is that, like, in Buddhism, we have a profound knowledge or the description about how the objective world is viewed by the subjective mind. And when we talk about looking at a flower, or, for example, normally it was said that like your consciousness or the eye consciousness is engaging with the flower, and or eye consciousness sees the flower, and there's no much detailed descriptions more than this. And when we listen from our science teachers about the scientific description part, like how light is fall on this flower and how light is reflected from these flowers and then goes to our eye and retina and then to the visual cortex, and then how brain processes the whole image. This kind of description enhances our own knowledge about that particular field of knowledge. And so there are many ways. This is just an example, and there are many ways that we can gain from the scientific community, and hope that like it is same for the scientific community also.
Okay, thanks. And I would echo the sentiment behind that. That you know, monastics and the scientists share something. We both sometimes need to get out a bit more. You know, I mean, scientists can be monastic in their own way, and each side coming out and looking at the world in a new way illuminates the perspective you have on your own, what you are familiar with, and I know that's true for me as a scientist. Well, to continue and answer the question, for me, sort of related a little to what Paul said, in the West, and in our realm of professional science, many people adhere to the view of Stephen Jay Gould, the late Stephen Jay Gould, who said that science and religion were non-overlapping magisteria, that even if you avoid some of the worst culture wars and conflict you might read about in the United States, that they have little to say to each other and little they should say to each other. And that's fine, but it ignores the fundamental fact that, you know, faith and reason coexist in human beings all over the world. So that's cleaving humans in an unnatural way. So for me, the fact that the dialogue works, is fruitful, is rich, is invigorating and inspiring to each side and the practitioners, and makes them look at their own fields in a new way, is the biggest achievement so far. And to me, the next step is, yes, it's got to be implementation. I mean, we may hope for some of these grand advances of a general theory of neuroscience, but it probably isn't going to happen anytime soon. So in the meantime, we have to, you know, chip away perhaps at the surety of some Western science communities that their paradigm is all they need to make progress, when manifestly they're not explaining everything, so they have no complete explanation, no perfect theory, and find ways forward to increase the sort of landscape of overlap and collaboration in scientific experiments, in visits and exchanges. And I think we've laid the groundwork for that, and this dialogue for now more than a decade shows that it can be done. Anyone else on this first question?
All the great scholars and my colleagues, venerables. It's a great pleasure and great opportunity to be the part of this conference and dialogue. I think in past 2 days, and today half of the day, I've listened to great scholars from all the different fields, from the field of neuroscience, from the field of cosmology, from the field of kind of theoretical science, kind of, how to say, physics, and from the field of experimental physics, and from the field of very specific research kind of department, doing research in the field of kind of the rebirth and very specific type, and then also, of course, from the field of Tibetan medicine. If I personally, privately, try to access these literatures in these fields, definitely I may need to use probably half a year. And then even after that, I will definitely end up in not getting such a kind of valuable and essential informations. Those were kind of served, those were provided in all these couple of days. So it's a kind of one of unprecedented experience and occasion in my life to be in such a kind of environment. And I feel I learned a lot in a couple of days, more than I could have learned in past many years, though I access few of the books from time to time. At the same time, I remember the last 2 words from your book. Probably you may not remember that. Science and the culture and the spirituality and the religion is a creation of the human being. And each of these have its own beauties. And we are sharing these beauties. And we need to be kind of open to see the beauty in different field of studies, different field of kind of thoughts, and all those things. So I believe that all of my colleagues joining here are very open-minded people from all the different fields. There could be a lot of kind of hardliner scientists who may never kind of accept to be kind of present in such kind of a conference and dialogue. So I do really appreciate your openness. That is something I really respect from the depth of my heart. And at the same time, in the future, I think it's very important to have similar dialogues as much as possible with participation of more and more monastic scholars and more and more other open-minded kind of scholars and academics in the field of various different types of sciences. There could be other varieties of science, field of sciences, which are left over in today's dialogue. I think it is very important to include them too. And of course, as Dr. Rangan has suggested, it's very important to include other kind of contemplative traditions too. Because after all, it's a learning process. We can learn from anywhere. We can even learn from a kid. So why cannot we learn from any other contemplative tradition? It should always remain open. So I think we have to be very open in kind of these kind of organizing these kind of dialogues and then conferences in the future. And I hope really, really kind of respectable organizers, Dr. Bryce Johnson and Venerable Geshe Khagdurla, the director of the LTWA, the library, will definitely take in consideration about what my colleagues have suggested, and we request you to do that. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, that's a really nice sentiment, and I would say, yes, I think we have a message to expand the conversation. We've heard earlier that it would be nice to have women more involved. There are fields that I think illuminate many areas that we've been talking about, such as philosophy, which are not truly represented. There are other meditative traditions. So yes, the conversation can be expanded. A danger is only if it becomes a little too closed loop. We just stay in a comfortable circle of the people who are familiar with these dialogues. Let me make a segue to the second question, but before the second question, I'm going to ask for anyone, it could be everyone if they want, but anyone who wants to, I'm going to ask you to do a consciously very short thing, sound bite, to say what's the single most interesting, important, surprising thing you learned in the last 2.5 days. The floor is open for that. Short, few sentences. The thing that strikes you just off the top of your head, obviously.
I learned a little bit about the black hole from dear Professor Paul, and I also learned something about the neutrons and the quarks and all those things. And then beside that, I learned a lot of things. So those are really very exciting things that I learned. I do appreciate that. Thank you.
Anybody?
In one sentence, although the Buddhist philosophy and the scientific philosophy start with very different assumptions, I've learned how similar they are in the sense that their methodology is both the same of looking at an assumption and then testing it out, not assuming that it's true, but trying it out, see whether it works.
Anyone else?
I've learned that from Dr. Bruce about how they are taking very seriously to try to find out mind out of brain, mind outside of the brain. Another thing is I was very interested with Dr. His presentation that Ravindraji, the recurrent corresponding that thalamic cortical information, which, well, usually I'm a little bit interested in thalamic cortical, so thank you very much for that.
So I'll go next because it relates to yours. The thing that struck me the most, because it's present in the Buddhist tradition and empirically from Bruce's talk, is, it's a game changer if a mind doesn't need a brain. In my field, it changes everything about the search for life in the universe. We were looking for our keys under the lamp because that's where we can look for our keys. We look for planets around stars and life forms on planets that are like us. But if mind and consciousness and intelligence doesn't need a brain, then we don't really know what we're doing.
아니 개인하게 가든지 담시시 나와야 때문에 나서 사가다 칠로기 같이 짜친부 여바이네 알아서 레버 춘지도 제와이 주시 칠로 가도 레버도 제와이 주시는데 띵가 빼나 갈로그라 나오도 수중서제.
The one thing that struck me most was the cartoon related with the powers of 10 that is shown in David's presentation.
Yeah, Simpson's rule.
I literally learned something from every presenter, needless to say. But one thing that really struck me was Dr. Rajendra's presentation on how the meditative states can have an effect on the sleeping pattern, and in turn, how such change in the sleeping pattern can then affect health. That you can have an impact on your health and well-being. That one was a new insight for me, and I'd really like to learn a little bit more about that. Thank you.
I was most impressed by the way that the monastic graduates learn. I have never met a group that is so present while learning and takes such an active role in questioning and arguing. It's an active learning that I wish I could bring back with me and spread around to American institutions of learning. And as in most meetings like this, some of the most valuable and wonderful conversations happened not up here on the stage, but sitting around a dinner table or sitting in a chair side by side and sharing ideas just with a few people. So I remind the conference presenters that they provided us with a great set of opportunities to do that this time. I'd love to see that continue, and I thank the monastic graduates for educating me about new ways to learn.
I mean, I got to echo that, since I hope to write a book on that particular topic, but having taught in the workshops and had some conversations at this meeting, I would like somehow to bring the 22 million undergraduates in the United States at colleges and universities to be flies on the wall to see what happens in the classroom here with you. And then say, go back, do this, you know, do your best, try and do this, and laugh more. Any other?
Actually, just a segue from what you just said at the very end, and on a half serious note, the thing that I have at least liked the most was that the monks have a great sense of humor. And even when we don't understand what they're saying, it's good. It's great to see that people are cracking up, both on stage and outside.
And also, just in line with those comments, as another university teacher, really echoing, learning deeply from the enthusiasm for learning among all of you, especially from folks that have had no previous exposure to science. I mean, had no kind of investment already in learning more about something that one already knew about. And to see the enthusiasm and openness displayed continuously all the time was it's remarkable, and I totally agree. I'd like to bring all of the students in America here to witness this.
Any more for the quick response and the thing they learned that surprised them the most? Because otherwise we'll move to the second question. Okay. And the second question really gets back to the title of this panel, which is Serving Humanity. So I'll read the second question and then I'll sort of crystallize it with a little more focus in the second part. We didn't solve the problems we hoped to be solved by development of science and technology. What should be our future directions for solving the problems we face? And that's kind of a huge question, so let me give it a slightly tighter focus on what we've been here for, and ask anyone to respond on the question of how we take the things we've learned and talked about and give them an application that benefits humanity, that improves people's wellness or state of being or illuminates their lives in some way. Again, it's quite a challenging goal, but it should be a goal of this dialogue. Anyone can take that on. So really it's the next step for this dialogue, in as much as it leads to applications and tangible effects and benefits. Yeah, I know, it's a tough one, isn't it? Well, okay, I'll start then. So since I've just laid it out there. Okay, well, first of all, I don't think we don't have to be too despairing about science and technology. I mean, I will just make a couple of comments on that score. I don't think it's a negative, positive thing. The failures of the materialist, reductionist view of science have been clearly on display in the last 3 days. However, science and technology in the last century have raised 1.5 billion people out of poverty and improved lifespans by 20 years. That is a phenomenal impact on the human race. There's no reason we can't feed a planet with 7 billion people. So, the landscape is not bleak in that regard. The failures are there, but they don't overwhelm the successes. As far as taking this in the direction of benefit, it's far from my field, but I've seen very clearly the ways in which the illumination of the boundaries of the Western view of these scientific fields leads to new insights and new ways of thinking. And even without the revolution that would accompany a paradigm shift with a true theory of neuroscience akin to our fundamental theories of physics, it's clear that there are ways which we can improve wellness. I mean, Bruce alluded to some very profound ones, and we've heard some more this morning. So there are ways in which using the information that is, a landscape that the Buddhist tradition has experienced for centuries, and the ideas go back millennia, bringing those into the Western realm of medicine just seems like an obvious way to improve lives. And of course, bringing those philosophical ideas into the Western way of doing science, it opens up the box on Western science and leads to the possibility of better theories in places where basically we're stuck. So that's what I would see as our possibilities.
Tene sun dule teke tsiri ngarang tsiri jang ba teke jajong kare yo ma ti siwon da ja ko son tene ngarang nan ju chena jin tsiri ba le ta dang de tsiri ba se de le ji so so ko ta nyan ra da tene ju ben jong ra bo tene ji gi che do le pege ngo bo sa chon she de zo da tene da ji tong zu yo ina ya darin da ba tene gyalan na ba ni zu ben tene kewa na ba je on dule sano ko yang bo ji da 피게레지 리바 양다고 고니 제순장네 지 준생 회사 여바 던지 통송 던지 인도래 나랑 단다디 게힐라도라제 디네 고니 로바 단다 지세 다타베이스제 코나바니는 던지 따레 고가 나와티 투지체 휴저다 마오바나 문투네 디네 고가 던지 나투비나 체리나레 산노 고양보 피게 응위니 니당 가렌도 디토레 힌두세네 준생 양다데 뎀바진 두나 디 제선 랑엔지 여바딩에 단다하 고소 마음바는 문투니 자체르 첸 로그 산팅도 말아서 남빙원이 시비나야 유노 마보지나네 드니 리바 양다 제선 랑구레스 니 카시지레 드니 예치기 롱라 땡고사 손여데 대양 양터투비나 리바 양다 투고사 손여레 디인들레 참말로 리바 양다 제선 랑니 기바지장레야 디인들레 리바 양다 제선 랑구요나 바사드길 바용레 디인들레 단다 데 치린 카완지게 되니 단다 진데 차상데 되니 비게 완전 치리 된데 거니 이렇게 제토요 말이스 얘네야 당가 편수상 고두만 치네 된데 돈이 다 차상디 돈이 이렇게 제토야게 레와요스 된데 송송 간디지 돈이 이렇게 제토비나 양으로 손에 비게 데비 되는데 가렌도나 드르투군도나 나라이나 된디지 제선란데 요마도 네산주 디인세네 틴체순시야게 차기메디 인두레 마음바나는 문투니 된데게 드니 당 나다버시비나 소소 차키레야레마도 된데 차키 쪼야게 나라는 니바 가게메 디 인두레 된데게 차키 쪼야게 니바 요니도 손레 네단다 고간데 선네 드니 곰바 만치 예네 차키 쫀투야게 드니 타히 나로시에스 된다 마음바는 문투니 휴니 말만 로그라 되게 단다 자름 보지 그때 공지 사진 자체가 망보지 요래 단단에 단다데 배 마음바는 장이日本데 배 시대 때니 주토바다 그게 희자 간지나 일란도르기 지순라니 장토바 던지기 공지 사모진 두산에 가진 나랑 손한 대숑 디인들의 마음바나는 가서 손디 문투는 로트비나 던지 돌이 펜도 쳔보지 요사레선 대전소다 데 저기 자 쳔보지는 상에 때 담배인데 따들이 뒤수면 두더니 다란 인데 참말로 두지제 요야
I think it's related with first question, and Before I joined this 1-month pilot workshop, I don't have any knowledge in science. This is first time I learned science. And I am a Buddhist teacher in my school. And so after attending this 1-month workshop and this 3-day conference, there are many incidents or the knowledge that I gained from these conferences and this conference and this workshop strengthened many of beliefs and the teachings that I teach in the monastery. And on the other hand, before I came to this conference and this workshop, I have a belief or a view that the scientists are the kind of people that concerned only about material development and making money. And by listening to presenters and the teachers during the workshop, I came to realize that all the scientists are not like that. And there are ones who follow like empirical evidence and who try to find whatever they believe and whatever they do, they always give reason and empirical evidence as the highest authority or highest level. And so this is kind of important for us. So in the future, if through our collaboration or from the scientific research, if we can find any kind of theory or kind of any field of knowledge that is driven by reason and empirical evidence, then even if it goes against my past belief and traditions, I'm ready to follow the new path that is shown by reason and evidence. And also after attending this conference and workshop, it became clearer for me why His Soul is always encouraging us to learn science. And so I'm not in a position to organize this kind of dialogues, but those people who are in a position to organize workshops and conference like this, I request them to continue this kind of programs, and especially Gisela and Bryce. We would like to thank all the presenters for having this program and presentation.
And I would note, actually, not to correct you at all, but that you are all the Geshes in the program and all the graduates of the Science Leadership Program and all the students that have been through the Emory program after their training are indeed in a position to lead the dialogue themselves. That's part of the point. That's part of why we're doing this. Maybe the dialogue is small, maybe it's within the monastery with your young monks, or maybe it's outside in the community near your monastery, but you actually are, you're equipped to continue the dialogue. Any other comments on the second question?
I think this is a very important question of how will this dialogue help humanity, because I think it's a question that scientists have gotten out of the habit of asking. And I think one of the effects of this dialogue will be to remind scientists of why we are doing science. And when scientists have to apply for a research grant or a paper for publication, we have to justify our choice of research participants, our choice of methodologies, our procedure, our instruments, our measurements, our statistical analysis, how it relates to previous knowledge, but we're not asked, how will this make people happier? We just assume that any advance in knowledge will help humanity, and as Chris pointed out, it often does, but not always. And if we made it a part of every grant application to ask, how will this make people happier? That would change maybe the type of research we do or how we do our research. So I think we need to keep asking ourselves, how does this work really help humanity, and how can we change it so it'll do it better? Just asking the question is half the battle, I think.
ngarang samja dabu taleng di toleng kabla chonang dabu chik ma ne shugo samsung nyama ngarang bayula peje tadu samba sem zambe shung tadu kabla nawa khare shago samna ta kharlo chirogi ngobo dang dinde shida nega shida megyo dabu chik sem dingone chash mo imba dabu chik pena shungchi mixe thenge mindu de ina shungi chik de tandanga sarbu tembo chirogi ne sukme de rangi semne chiro nans ta di indu samba dinde kyang ngarang ani ta shung shambal ke shigme sem zambe shung indu samba dinde rang sam degyo ani ta penzo hange kadin peshin penzo hange kadin de gejela namaso kadin chene ani sabjung chik charar kogap chik ras ani dele de samba sabjung lo tangbu di samloi wangzhen chende kablai ngarangi dingwengi samlo de bet gyura devs sem di chach mewa che dile kyang chacha sem di la tangzin chinge leba dabu chig yoba dende dabu chig yang samlo che kes dende dabu samlo che ke ani ta chik di ngarang so ani tangbu gi ani kharlo gore samlo di mewa soya de kale khabo shira do di tandu nga halam masona ta leba de chachum yimbi gi tes togba do chi kesong and dega nang sing ani ngarang so tanda sabjung parula ani tsendik dang ngarang so ani nambe tanda di parula ani Buddhist night sing ngarang so emori kapla di chi gore di kapla ni ngarang so toling chidu samba toling de sam kawa shagu yosana sem de kejale de sam shagu ngazuge ani nambe ngarang so tanda geshe dang ani khembu khong nam so chik kandi sungdu samba sem la du samba halam tserik be ge tyo len kya mewa do chik dinde do chik ta toba do chik lengyo ani dega nang sing sem diang e cha chim bu chik thungyo karsa dubyala an talen chongde dila karsa toleng dila samlo tandu samba ani tserik ba mangbu chigi ngarang zo sem diang halam nega chimbu imba dabu chikdang ke chimbu imba dabu chikdang yo kwaya dabu chikdang debi gi keje shido samba halam tsenibu sem ke maleng dabu chik ta dinde dabu chik talen digi kabla halam sem ke lemba mase halam sem la khoran so gi nyamshir chaya dabu chik ngarang chornang yang dila ani ngarang so ani khenre muche gi songdang chedu samba talen ani chogdun tangbu gi gejela gi songdang chedu samba yang halam ma sona ani sem yoba di chik dubya gi ani tablam sangbu da buje mangbu songna song ani dega na chik ngarang so ani di mai be ani thene shamba nam gi yang halam ma songna chik karsa sem gi ani nyamship che shamba da buje dang yang sem di yoba da buje dang and they are cousin nation around so David Presti Kongia and Ngonzo Pass Subjongi Kabla and Kongia Sung so. Ta Naran so any one the Sendik Diga Nambanyam do any Nambegi Serignam do chick, Tunga Dabachik. That didn't negative call to do some Nambe Serigla, Tomoma and Big any same singing or Sheba singing. Rolla. That didn't do somebody chick Diang Yimbache, Chingarangi Kare, Narang Gerwin and Sambatana Soran led to Samba, Sheba di Duptuba and a Karepen to Gudusana, Aransogi any Kewangachi singing Dobudan, leg in the singing, the Lela which Hagre some do. Didn't do some talent sound Dilani, cousin Yacharing Chai Parsing Allah, Rajesh Keja Tidu Samba, Keja Ding Lingme, Rala, Kongia Halam chick. ngone sem din nega chimbu da buchi dinde da busungs tangadi thalen di chona jong ani yang e chik kharsa kher mo chada gesela chik kaze thiwa chik di kandi chik kharsa shugo samsong de tena tuze mewe on de kandi shwe rang na di chik shugo samsong ina chisu shuna disare tande me ani yang chik chona di changdu samba Tulo Tobu Kagi Keshimburim like Gishela Sungiro did so nice to Tushena.
So this is kind of my experience with learning science and Buddhism. When I was in Nepal in my monastery and I was looking and studying the mind-only tracks, the Chitramanta tracks. At that time, like in that text, it has a lot of emphasis on the mind, and says the mind is the only real thing, and everything that you see in the physical world is kind of illusion or the projection of your mind. And at that time, I thought that like mind is the real thing, and there's no much value or no much reality related with the objective world. And then I came to Emory Science Workshop, and when I listened to the neuroscience classes, then it seems that like brain is more important than mind, and brain is the real thing, and mind is kind of a secondary thing. And even though normally like what you believe in the past is very difficult to give away or eliminate, but still when I listen to these neuroscience classes and science classes, my previous idea that like mind is the only real thing slowly begin to kind of decline, and it becomes kind of brain becomes the more significant part. And then after listening to the presentations during this conference, and especially like Bruce's presentation, it seems that now mind again is the most important thing, and there is a consciousness becomes the most important thing, and it is not only important, but there are like evidence to prove the existence of mind, and also like when I listen to Geshe Nyingma's and the Khen Rinpoche's presentations, they also talk about the existence of mind, and how this our mind and mental factors work, and we see the world through our mind and mental factors. So this is kind of my feeling or the experience related with a conference. And actually, I have a question for Geshe-la and Khen Rinpoche, but maybe because of the time, I will ask this question later.
Okay, thanks for that perspective. I also feel that I had lost my mind and maybe have found it again. We should be wrapping up, but I would ask anyone else who has comment on the second question, serving humanity particularly, if they want to speak.
Well, why we are learning science? Why science and Buddhism, or science and ancient culture conversation is important? Why we are doing that? What would be the result? That is very clear by His Holiness the Dalai Lama many times. So now our responsibility is, let's work on that path. So now what we should think is, how do we go on that? So I was suggesting them it would be good to make aware to the other monastic members who are not here. Thank you.
Dari Zondel de Japaji Tangur Chagita. Tindu Tano Wangza da Wangxie da Levachita Gol Kamina in the Peji Bug Sorry Wishune Ditol Chikalgan Zamchik Tishake you Yuting Sorbi. Tinga Swa Shivchons. Is a Manguch Tali in the or that it did sometimes. Tindu Tangaran, Tanda Pug Sorry Wakalan Zamchik that Chikaso Tating in sea. They do not need to mostly do sick clinging to a fake sorry with all tossed to none young men sometimes. Did the Dirisha. Kaisna, some jill linges swing it onto the Halam Chick with a child. And there's a chick toss Yamachi, soon down to the Kava you think so. Kaisan Pug sorry with the Shakespeare did so Nambeture. And to Karisha in the same boy share the station, Nambekol. Nangjul Matev Jing and to share Yaman. Did the Inea to Sugu Namcha on a never some serve that the gate Chendu, Pegit Yaji Missionary and the Casser. 니랄와 단의 중에 남샤디게디 쉬우지 개침입니다. 벤레베나 지지야마 교구도 시도간에 교갱어부디 가르생이 레세로지 파이케스티인도 간에 회지간주디나 세우용되도록 디너디 이게 저 메탈 또 투나나나 개침면으로 성도지 럽지 스티브나미나 아니 차비스기인도 간에 디게 레로 차도로 성도 애니네 나도 왕자 왕시지다고 지금 뭐비 돈의 소인도 간에 그나 소인이 휴직 할려버리샤 이가 좋아지죠 이내 다야직 왕시 가서 셰바다 셈지다 레인도 야 단다에 셰바다 셈지 찾고 쉬우제제 단대 물모도 해서 또 통되기도 진짜 되게 멘탈 내주 싫어야고요 이 직토 샤도나 섬스 so in my own experience there's a lot of information that Tibetan medicine can share to such kind of conference and especially like Buddhism and Tibetan medicines are almost the same when you explain about the like the consciousness and like so it's very important. I think my suggestion is to study at least basic concept of Tibetan medicine.
On the second question particularly, anyone? Yeah. Okay, last word.
Okay. So, I mean, as His Holiness himself said yesterday, there's a need for a secular ethics, maybe that comes out of these dialogues. But I would say that actually we need to expand that a little bit. We need a kind of package. I mean, I'm thinking of a cognitive toolkit, right? Things that would, the basics of science, reasoning, ethics, that everybody needs to know to be a citizen in the 21st century. So something that is easy enough that everybody can know it, and it doesn't depend on culture, and it is a package that will help all of us, at least, even if we cannot address all the problems of the world, we may have a method by which we can arrive at a reasonable answer. So that's.
Thanks very much. That's a great thought, and I think a nice way for the last word in this session. So I thank everyone for their great participation, not just now, but in the last 2.5 days. And so on behalf of all the panelists and the presenters, I'd like to thank the hosts of the TCV and the gracious and attentive staff, so I think we should thank them. And I'd also like to thank the staff, of course, of the Tibetan Library, in particular the phenomenal translators, the ones you haven't seen so much of, the ones on stage.
Now, since you have finished all the tough jobs, questions and answers, I'm going to tell you a story, which is going to take 2 hours only. There was a monk at the time of the Buddha. One morning when he was meditating, he felt that the Buddha has taught on many topics and answered many questions. But there are a number of questions related to whether what is the origin of the universe, and whether the universe will come to an end, whether there is life after death, and so forth. So he felt, I must get all these answers from Buddha, and if he's unable to come up with all the answers, I will stop training under him. So he immediately got up and went straight to the Buddha and said the same thing. Then the Buddha said, first of all, I never told you to train under me or to be my student. Then indirectly he gave an answer by asking a question to him by saying, suppose if somebody shoots an arrow to you and you are struck with that arrow and you are bleeding, at that point, what would you do? Will you take the arrow out and take the necessary medications? Or will you start asking all the philosophical questions? Who must have shot the arrow? Whether that person who shot the arrow has a mustache or not? How strong his arms may be? What are the bows and arrows made of? And are you going to say that unless I get all the related philosophical answers to these questions, I am not going to take any medical treatment? Will you say that, or will you take the medical treatment? Then the monk said, of course. It's bleeding. There's a lot of pain. The first thing I'll do is take the medical treatment. So the Buddha said, exactly. Well, you can always ask all these questions, but what is important is don't turn your eye, don't turn a blind eye to the prevalent sufferings that we see in the whole world, the whole universe. So what I'm really trying to say is, while you can all ask these questions about the origin of universe and consciousness and everything, I mean, it's extremely important for us to not to turn a blind eye to the pervading sufferings that we see all around the world. And Buddha was talking about alleviating the sufferings of not of the Buddhists or not of the Tibetans, but he's talking about removing the sufferings of all sentient beings. And that, I think, is really the ultimate goal of His Holiness. How can we, through this kind of dialogue, contribute towards a holistic health of the body, health of the mind? So through this exploration and dialogue itself is a contribution. So don't think, this is useless. But what I'm saying is, if we have this clear understanding that our pursuit of knowledge is towards that goal, then we may become even more effective. So that's why in Buddhism, whatever you do, motivation is the key factor. You may be doing the same thing, but if you have the motivation for a certain purpose, then it will be much more different than doing the same thing with a different motivation. So I really don't want to take any more time, but 2-3 words to the monks in Tibetan. I would say that in Tibetan. Da gindiba so tanda gindiba paji chobji chuguchi kondeka chuksumne pedi yore ene sabjong tashung ni pendo chung mangchaga tuksungdu tring songdula pendo chung mangbo songsu ene maongbala songdu diri chegoye da ta lehi de keshimbo imbandinde sungdu me hidag gawchung ngazu dinde jigta chungna samgi yore dinde jigta khodoji sen samgi yore rawa ngazu gonde kha ga nang thana thona chung tawa dige mangsha gonde kha ga tawa dige jo tawa da gibe hini dige da kimbu du samlo taime dinde mare ko khodo se mase se di sammal yungudu ga kogab ra mara se di dinde chudu ko kogab je ra khodoje se ne ni phendo yoba je thong yungde ta phendo yoba de thong ne ta lamga digan roe di pyoji benzo kang jigbu gi lenge mare 딩어도 상맥이 랭게래. 배낭어도 서로이나 배낭에 당부 희와이나 단댕어도 퇴바 망부 희우지 송도 소리에 sab중소에 망 다조지 지기열에 딜런 루승 코나 차샤와이나 데머리 유니버시티에 루승 톰나 디당기열에 세거 패밀리 파운데이션 루승 톰나 디당기열에 디 로다르 당기열에 다가나시 단다 템플턴 파운데이션 건 루승 다 송도 데당 다가나 루승 체다조지 나도게 이나 용조에 걸어요 말에 저서 당기열에 어디서 땅다 저서 땅warla 저서 탑기시에 루그마도 대가서 그 연구 말아 봐. 다티 탑기시도 레로면도 고모 자테로람네 레로에 짜네면도 띵고에네스디 휴는마도 제도 저서 용이엘라 땅은 저 로고체 되게 기기 넘버서요. 다 조망도 배나 에머리 유니버시티 게실럽선데 칼리 희봉원에 잡고요. 다가나싱에 로고 브라이스 존슨이나 다 배데 로추 궁네 단다버도 코란게 라포든데 삼라 레가 메와 독수 되게요. 독수진 칼리 잡네 미국 첨부 지진 지기요. 독스진에 다단던 룹디어마도 양아도 랭게 라삼로 나와이나 벤조 칸기 레기 디소 표지르 흉 나딘데 녀자 지에르와 단데데 데와 요레르와 요르데 디삼지기 마제나 독스 로샤나야 이직 미직 도 상마 제데 고에 차가 요메 강시르와 다이나미 군두기 공시데 살팀병 아주 고도 요레 흰기 요레 에네 딘데 저 마제나 만데켄지 샤도 요레 제당 아주 군두기 부서고 이네 딘데 아주 나이데 군두기 다 샤데나 티도와 데 초조가 냠레 인다스 초조가 냠레장 인다스 티어르디나 근데 이제 내가도 다 심진지 된다서 가도 망불라기 요래 내가도 베베 내다 쪼고 싶지 차도 요래 근데 저도 베베 내다 차리 샤와 있네 주문 내다 통부지가 랩고 요나 단단 내가도 미래린 이래기 깔레 잡네 근데 레베지 랩게레 마도게 때니마 카시지 재미 표현에 파르지우스 캠브레지 잡 양잠딩에 대잖아 가사 칸 랩게 말해 가서 단다 가사 가방 가데 도스나 해외면 가데 그도와 벤저면 가데 그도와 또 저서 당래 휴저는 또 랩게 말어 어디주다 지금 드링 sab종다 송도 독변 소세다 망보도 된데서 다 뒤통을 샤지네 엠베데 마제베체네 다 나버송거네 양 소송거네 다 진도 요나 가르토리나 점득해요 인지 메제고 무망보지기 송도 공고에 된데 말어 그 가르토리나 다 나버서 마지는 고마소소 나리야 게 망보 팀 거 단다 근데 버치니 다 루무첸게 갈 숨고도 내가 희우 중소 나중에 마음벌 차로 가르쳐도는 나게 숨고도 루무첸 차로 나투 맞으면 내수 가가래라 봐 Tindeji gungba korne lawa kora kori hidaya korwa ngune. Da dagana hiko hene sumel matne ba namazu tungden le yore. Yudi da di karsa kora da kanje di jachesa chine ngazu di kujo madana ngazu michi ni kujo dana kujo tibge mare. Tinde yenju di ngazu samegi ko lehi de kechimbu chik si chene jabjo nangro nas. Ene pera ngazu gondi kha nangla nangbe chuga lobjon jang de yakbo hiwjere de yakbo yina ya Korang Korean Gurban Roding till a tunjur chematuna, Chenik adaptation says to what the tunjur chematuna. So Yaku huge and a Koryu the Duja should do Tara Hindresi, the Luju Koran Tagayore, and a Puna Nizu Chasaro. Was he do tang to the Zumbling the Yam the Pumanyam Dotuvia Tandala, so should a resume the Yovetoni, any Zumbling Gala Dinjara to a Goyorwa. Or the Rawalata Manguji Gudua, or Tindeta, near Mangush Shuguem that sentence I mean, or they should do any. Wangbala, Nyamrona Ronas, Tushui. So I was just saying few words to the monks, which I don't have to translate. And I was simply asking them to extend all the possible cooperation to make this kind of program a success. So finally, I would really like to express my deepest appreciation to all the scholars, participants, because it is not only that you have come here and presented a talk or presented a paper, but it is your whole being that has come here with great openness, with a great wish to share everything that you have, without personal egoism. In many of these conferences, we do see people who really want to just present a paper and make them famous. I've seen this on many occasions. And they don't show any concern about the time, just keeps on talking. I mean, there are so many things happen like that. But here, really, it was almost like a gathering of the family, Everybody was really like, there was no protocol, there was no formality, everybody was easy to talk anytime, any point of the time, and everybody was ready to share anything, and that is the greatness of this conference. And the purpose of this conference, as His Holiness has highlighted in his book and in many of his speeches, the purpose of this is not to glorify Tibetan Buddhism or not to glorify science, but it is through this mutual sharing learning, how can we make our at least small contribution towards the betterment of whole mankind. Even if you don't want to talk about all sentient beings, at least how can we contribute towards the betterment of the mankind. So this is really, His Holiness has mentioned this in his book, that this engagement with the science is a kind of a spiritual commitment. So therefore, it is important for all of us who engage in this kind of activities to encourage ourselves very often and reflect and review what am I doing and in which direction I'm going, how through this kind of project I'm contributing towards the well-being of everybody, you see. So each of us has a responsibility and we are able to make a contribution in this way. So this is not a small thing, So therefore this is really a time to dedicate all the wonderful merit that we have earned. I'm sure that we have earned a lot of merit. So therefore let us, in the Buddhist way, dedicate all the merit that we have earned for the benefit of, all sentient beings and for the long life of His Holiness Dalai Lama and many other great thinkers and leaders who has this vision to serve human beings and who are, dedicating their life for this kind of purposes. So I do not want to call by the names of each and every individual, but I would really like to once again thank wholeheartedly on behalf of Library of Tibetan Works and Archives and on behalf of the Tibetan community and Tibetan monks for your participation. And as was urged repeatedly that such kind of conferences should be organized again and again. Of course, this is very much dependent on Kunga Thundup. You know Kunga Thundup? This is a Tibetan term for money. So Kunga Thundup means an object where everybody is very attracted and which makes everybody successful. so if the money, Kunga Thundup, is forthcoming, this is another great, facility. But even otherwise, we should try our best through our joint collaboration, how to organize this kind of conferences, or maybe doing this, the same thing in a different way to continue this kind of wonderful work. So I would like to now thank formally to all the teachers and also all the monks. So can you, this is the Tibetan tradition of offering khadak, which symbolizes long life and purity. I must not forget thanking all my library staffs. I'm really privileged to have wonderful, energetic team of staffs from the library who are responsible for all my success. They're videotaping, recording, making everything, photographing, whatever, translating everything. So I take the credit, you see, as we always do in all the institutions, the boss takes the credit, but the people who are working behind the scenes, they are indispensable people. And I must thank them. And then lastly, I would also like to thank the Tibetan Children's Village, those people who were serving the food, who were serving the tea, and then all the, and for arranging the stage and everything, I cannot, enumerate each and everything. So I would really like to thank all the TCB staffs who has been so generous and so kind. And then lastly, I would like to thank the observers also. Because in the absence of our observers, our talk will be of not much, not much meaning, you see. So it is because of you who stood firm with us in this cold weather, which also inspired us to continue this dialogue for 3 days. So thank you, all of you. Thank you very much.